The federal building in downtown Los Angeles had been transformed into a military-style command center, with armored vehicles positioned at every entrance and federal agents wearing tactical gear patrolling the perimeter in patterns that suggested preparation for urban warfare rather than routine law enforcement operations. Attorney General Pam Bondi stood in the building's Secure Operations Center, studying intelligence reports that revealed the most dangerous development in American gang violence since the crack epidemic of the 1980s. The investigation, spanning 18 months and involving resources from across federal law enforcement, had uncovered something that gang experts had long considered impossible: a formal alliance between the Bloods and Crips that had transformed Los Angeles street gangs from neighborhood nuisances into a sophisticated criminal army capable of challenging law enforcement authority across entire sections of the city. The operations center itself represented the largest gang investigation facility ever established by federal authorities. 85 workstations equipped with real-time surveillance systems connected investigators to databases maintained by local police departments, federal agencies, and international law enforcement organizations. Wall-mounted displays showed live feeds from cameras positioned throughout South Los Angeles, where the Gang Alliance had established what federal investigators described as liberated zones, where law enforcement could not operate safely and where gang authority had effectively replaced government control. The Bloods-Crips alliance, officially known within gang circles as the United Colors Coalition, had been forged through 2 years of secret negotiations between gang leaders who had recognized that their decades-long conflict was limiting their criminal potential while providing law enforcement with opportunities to exploit their divisions. The alliance represented a fundamental shift in American gang culture, from territorial disputes focused on neighborhood control to a coordinated criminal enterprise that operated like a paramilitary organization with sophisticated command structures, advanced weapons, and financial resources that exceeded those of many legitimate businesses. The investigation had begun when LAPD Gang Intelligence Unit Detective Maria Santos noticed unusual patterns in gang violence statistics that suggested something fundamental had changed in the dynamics of Los Angeles street gangs. Santos, a 20-year veteran who had worked every gang-infested neighborhood in the city, had spent her career tracking the evolution of Bloods and Crips operations from their origins in the 1970s through their expansion in the 1980s and 1990s to their more recent adaptation to changing urban demographics and law enforcement tactics. Santos had been analyzing quarterly crime statistics when she noticed that gang violence had decreased significantly in certain neighborhoods while simultaneously increasing in sophistication and lethality. Drive-by shootings had been replaced by planned ambushes using military-style tactics. Individual drug dealers had been replaced by coordinated distribution networks that operated with the efficiency of legitimate businesses. Most concerning was evidence that gangs were coordinating their activities across traditional territorial boundaries in ways that suggested formal alliance agreements rather than temporary truces. The initial breakthrough had come when Santos noticed that arrest records for Bloods and Crips members showed an unusual pattern. Individuals from traditionally rival gangs were being arrested together for crimes that required coordination and planning. Bank robberies, armored car heists, and sophisticated drug trafficking operations were being conducted by mixed crews that included members from gangs that had been killing each other for decades. FBI Gang Task Force Director Marcus Rodriguez presented the intelligence picture that had emerged from 18 months of investigation. Rodriguez had spent his career investigating organized crime, from traditional mafia families to emerging criminal enterprises, but the Bloods-Crips alliance represented something entirely new in American criminal organizations. The alliance had successfully combined the street-level violence and territorial control of traditional gangs with the organizational sophistication and financial resources of international criminal enterprises. What we're confronting is not traditional gang activity, Rodriguez began, clicking through slides that showed the alliance's organizational structure. This is a hybrid criminal organization that combines the manpower and territorial control of street gangs with the sophistication of organized crime families and the tactical capabilities of paramilitary organizations. They've essentially created a criminal army that controls territory, operates sophisticated criminal enterprises, and has the capability to challenge law enforcement authority through coordinated violence. The organizational chart revealed the complexity of the alliance structure. At the top was a 7-member council that included representatives from major Bloods and Crips sets, along with liaisons from allied gangs including MS-13, 18th Street, and various prison gangs that provided coordination with incarcerated members. The council operated through consensus decision-making that allowed each constituent gang to maintain its identity while coordinating activities that served the broader alliance objectives. The West Side operations were commanded by Raymond Big Ray Williams, a former Crips leader who had spent 15 years in federal prison for racketeering charges before being released and immediately assuming a leadership role in alliance formation. Williams had used his prison experience to build relationships with gang leaders from across the spectrum of Los Angeles criminal organizations, and his release had coincided with the beginning of serious alliance negotiations between traditionally rival groups. Williams represented the new generation of gang leadership that had evolved during the mass incarceration era of the 1990s and 2000s. Unlike earlier gang leaders who had focused primarily on territorial control and personal reputation, Williams understood that criminal organizations needed to evolve to survive in an environment of enhanced law enforcement capabilities and changing urban demographics. His leadership had been instrumental in convincing traditional gang leaders that cooperation was more profitable than conflict. The East Side operations were led by Keisha K-Money Johnson, a former Bloods associate who had become one of the most powerful female gang leaders in Los Angeles history. Johnson had built her reputation through sophisticated financial operations that included money laundering, real estate investment, and even legitimate business ventures that provided cover for criminal activities. Her recruitment into the alliance leadership had been crucial to gaining support from female gang members who controlled significant portions of drug distribution networks. Johnson's background was particularly significant because it demonstrated how gang leadership had evolved to include individuals with advanced education and legitimate business experience. She had earned a business degree from a community college while serving time for drug trafficking charges and had used her education to develop sophisticated financial strategies that had made her one of the wealthiest gang leaders in the city. The South Los Angeles operations were commanded by Carlos C. Dog Martinez, a former 18th Street leader who had been recruited into the alliance as a liaison with Latino gang organizations. Martinez had spent 20 years building relationships between African American and Latino gangs that had traditionally been rivals, and his inclusion in the alliance leadership represented the coalition's success in transcending racial boundaries that had historically limited gang cooperation. The criminal activities conducted by the alliance were diverse and sophisticated, representing a quantum leap in gang criminal capabilities. Drug trafficking operations had evolved from street-level dealing to wholesale distribution networks that imported drugs directly from Mexican cartels and distributed them through sophisticated networks that covered the entire West Coast. The alliance had essentially eliminated the middleman operations that had traditionally connected street gangs to major drug suppliers, allowing them to increase profits while reducing exposure to law enforcement interdiction. The drug trafficking network was structured like a legitimate business, with specialized roles including importation specialists who coordinated with Mexican suppliers, distribution managers who oversaw regional networks, and retail coordinators who managed street-level sales operations. Quality control procedures ensured consistent product standards, while sophisticated accounting systems tracked revenue and expenses with accuracy that exceeded many legitimate businesses. Weapons trafficking operations had grown to include military-grade firearms obtained through corrupt contacts within the defense industry, law enforcement agencies, and international arms dealers. The alliance had successfully obtained automatic weapons, armor-piercing ammunition, and even explosives that provided them with firepower that could challenge law enforcement tactical units. The weapons were distributed through networks that ensured every alliance member had access to advanced firearms, while maintaining security that prevented law enforcement infiltration. Human trafficking operations brought victims from across the United States and internationally to Los Angeles, where they were forced to work in prostitution, drug trafficking, and other criminal activities controlled by the alliance. The human trafficking network was particularly sophisticated, using legitimate businesses, including modeling agencies, entertainment companies, and labor contractors to recruit and transport victims while avoiding detection by law enforcement agencies that focused on traditional trafficking indicators. Money laundering operations processed criminal proceeds through networks of legitimate businesses that included restaurants, retail stores, construction companies, and even technology startups. The money laundering system was so sophisticated that it had successfully cleaned hundreds of millions of dollars in criminal proceeds while avoiding detection by federal financial monitoring systems. The alliance had essentially created its own banking system that operated within legitimate financial institutions while remaining invisible to traditional anti-money laundering controls. DEA Los Angeles Division Director Jennifer Martinez presented the drug trafficking intelligence that revealed the scope of the alliance's narcotics operations. Martinez had spent her career investigating drug trafficking organizations, from street-level dealers to international cartels, but the alliance's drug operations represented a new model that combined the territorial control of street gangs with the supply chain management of international trafficking organizations. The alliance has essentially eliminated traditional boundaries between wholesale and retail drug trafficking, Martinez reported, displaying maps that showed drug distribution networks covering multiple states. They've established direct relationships with Mexican cartels that allow them to import drugs at wholesale prices while maintaining control over retail distribution through their territorial networks. This vertical integration has made them one of the most profitable drug trafficking organizations on the West Coast. The drug trafficking operations were structured around long-term contracts with major Mexican cartels that guaranteed consistent supply and pricing. The alliance had successfully negotiated exclusive distribution rights for certain geographic areas, effectively creating monopolies that eliminated competition while maximizing profits. The contracts included provisions for territorial protection, quality guarantees, and even dispute resolution mechanisms that operated like legitimate business agreements. Distribution networks were managed through sophisticated logistics systems that tracked inventory, monitored sales performance, and optimized distribution routes to maximize efficiency while minimizing law enforcement exposure. The alliance had developed its own transportation networks that used legitimate businesses to move drugs across state lines while avoiding detection by interdiction operations that focused on traditional trafficking methods. Quality control procedures ensured that drugs met consistent standards that built customer loyalty while reducing health risks that might attract law enforcement attention. The alliance had even established its own testing laboratories that analyzed drug purity and identified potentially dangerous adulterants, demonstrating a level of sophistication that rivaled legitimate pharmaceutical operations. Financial management systems tracked revenue and expenses with precision that allowed alliance leadership to optimize operations while identifying opportunities for expansion. Sophisticated accounting procedures included cost analysis, profit margin calculations, and performance metrics that were used to evaluate the effectiveness of different distribution strategies and territorial arrangements. ATF Gang Division Director Michael Torres presented the weapons trafficking intelligence that revealed how the alliance had obtained military-grade firearms that provided them with capabilities that exceeded those of traditional street gangs. Torres had spent his career investigating firearms trafficking, from individual gun runners to international arms dealers. But the alliance's weapons operations represented a new category of threat that combined traditional trafficking methods with sophisticated procurement strategies. The alliance has successfully obtained weapons that are typically available only to military and law enforcement agencies, Torres reported, displaying photographs of weapons seized during recent operations. They've established relationships with corrupt individuals within the defense industry, law enforcement agencies, and international arms dealers that have provided them with automatic weapons, armor-piercing ammunition, and even military-grade explosives. The weapons procurement network included relationships with corrupt employees at defense contractors who had access to military weapons and ammunition. These individuals had been recruited through a combination of financial inducements and coercion, and they provided the alliance with weapons that were diverted from legitimate military contracts. The sophistication of the procurement network suggested that the alliance had successfully identified and exploited vulnerabilities in defense industry security procedures. Law enforcement corruption had provided the alliance with access to weapons seized during police operations and military surplus equipment that was supposed to be destroyed or returned to federal authorities. Corrupt police officers and federal agents had been recruited to provide weapons, ammunition, and even intelligence about law enforcement operations that allowed the alliance to avoid interdiction while expanding their weapons stockpiles. International arms trafficking relationships connected the alliance to weapons suppliers in Eastern Europe, Central America, and Asia, who provided military-grade firearms that were smuggled into the United States through sophisticated networks that exploited weaknesses in border security and customs enforcement. These relationships had been developed through alliance connections to international criminal organizations that had established global weapons trafficking networks. The weapons distribution system ensured that alliance members had access to advanced firearms while maintaining operational security that prevented law enforcement infiltration. Weapons were stored in secure facilities that were protected by sophisticated security systems and distributed through networks that compartmentalized information to prevent comprehensive law enforcement mapping of the weapons trafficking operation. FBI Violent Crimes Division Director Sarah Thompson presented the intelligence on alliance violence that demonstrated how traditional gang warfare had evolved into sophisticated paramilitary operations that challenged law enforcement capabilities. Thompson had spent her career investigating violent criminal organizations, but the alliance's violence represented a new category of threat that combined traditional gang brutality with tactical sophistication that rivaled military operations. The alliance has fundamentally changed the nature of gang violence in Los Angeles, Thompson reported, displaying tactical analysis of recent alliance operations. They've replaced random drive-by shootings with planned military-style operations that use advanced weapons, sophisticated tactics, and intelligence gathering that allows them to target law enforcement personnel and facilities with precision that we've never seen from street gangs. The violence had evolved from reactive territorial disputes to proactive operations designed to achieve specific strategic objectives. Alliance operations included coordinated attacks on rival gangs that were designed to eliminate competition while expanding territorial control. The attacks used military-style tactics including reconnaissance, coordinated movement, and sophisticated weapons that ensured operational success while minimizing alliance casualties. Law enforcement targeting had become increasingly sophisticated, with alliance members conducting surveillance of police officers, federal agents, and their families to gather intelligence that could be used for intimidation or targeted violence. The surveillance operations used advanced technology, including drones, electronic surveillance equipment, and even sophisticated cyber warfare capabilities that allowed the alliance to monitor law enforcement communications and activities. Territorial control operations had evolved beyond traditional gang methods to include sophisticated urban warfare tactics that allowed the alliance to establish and maintain control over specific geographic areas. These operations included coordinated attacks on law enforcement facilities, strategic positioning of weapons caches, and even the establishment of checkpoints that controlled access to alliance-controlled territory. The psychological warfare component included systematic intimidation of witnesses, jurors, and law enforcement personnel that was designed to undermine the criminal justice system's ability to prosecute alliance members. The intimidation campaigns used sophisticated intelligence gathering to identify vulnerabilities of targeted individuals and their families, allowing the alliance to apply precise pressure that achieved maximum results while minimizing exposure to law enforcement retaliation. LAPD Gang Intelligence Unit Chief Detective Maria Santos presented the territorial control analysis that demonstrated how the alliance had successfully established effective governmental control over significant portions of Los Angeles. Santos had spent 20 years tracking gang territorial evolution, but the alliance's territorial operations represented something entirely new: the establishment of areas where gang authority had effectively replaced government control. The alliance has successfully established what can only be described as liberated zones, where law enforcement cannot operate safely and where alliance authority has replaced government control, Santos reported, displaying maps that showed alliance-controlled territory in red. These areas include neighborhoods where police responses are delayed or prevented entirely, where alliance members operate openly without fear of arrest, and where residents look to gang leadership rather than government authorities for security and dispute resolution. The territorial control was maintained through a combination of violence, intimidation, and community services that created population support for Alliance authority. Alliance members provided security services that protected residents from crime while simultaneously engaging in criminal activities that generated revenue. This dual role allowed the Alliance to position itself as both a source of security and economic opportunity within communities that had been historically underserved by government institutions. Community services provided by the Alliance included dispute resolution, security services, and even basic social services that had traditionally been provided by government agencies. Alliance leaders had established informal courts that resolved disputes between residents, security forces that patrolled neighborhoods, and economic development programs that provided employment opportunities for community members. The economic component of territorial control included sophisticated business operations that provided legitimate employment while generating revenue for criminal activities. Alliance-controlled businesses included restaurants, retail stores, construction companies, and service businesses that served as community anchors while simultaneously functioning as criminal enterprises. Population control was maintained through a combination of services and intimidation that created community dependence on Alliance authority. Residents who cooperated with Alliance leadership received protection and economic opportunities, while those who challenged Alliance authority faced intimidation, violence, or economic retaliation that demonstrated the consequences of opposition. Bondi studied the intelligence reports that covered the walls of the operations center, each document representing months of investigation by federal agents and local police officers who had risked their lives to gather intelligence about one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in American history. The maps showing Alliance-controlled territory in red revealed how deeply the organization had penetrated American urban areas and how successfully they had challenged government authority. "What we're confronting is not traditional gang activity," Bondi announced to the assembled task force. "This is an insurgency, a coordinated challenge to government authority that uses violence, intimidation, and alternative governance to establish criminal control over American territory. The Alliance has essentially declared war on the rule of law, and we must respond with the full force of federal law enforcement." The response strategy, designated Operation Unified Strike, would involve the largest gang enforcement operation in American history. The operation would require coordination between federal agencies, state authorities, and local police departments to simultaneously target Alliance operations across multiple states while disrupting their command structure and seizing their financial assets. Phase 1 would involve coordinated arrests of over 400 Alliance members across Los Angeles County, targeting the organization's leadership structure and key operational personnel. The arrests would be synchronized to prevent the Alliance from activating contingency plans or retaliating against law enforcement personnel and their families. Each arrest team would include federal agents, local police officers, and tactical specialists equipped to handle the advanced weapons and sophisticated defenses that characterized Alliance operations. Phase 2 would involve civil asset forfeiture actions against over $500 million in Alliance assets, including real estate, businesses, vehicles, and financial accounts that had been purchased with criminal proceeds. The forfeiture actions would target the economic foundation of Alliance operations while providing resources that could be used for community development programs in areas that had been controlled by the Alliance. Phase 3 would involve dismantling the territorial control systems that had allowed the Alliance to establish governmental authority in specific geographic areas. This would require coordinated operations to re-establish law enforcement presence, restore government services, and provide security for residents who had been living under Alliance control. Phase 4 would involve comprehensive prosecution of Alliance members using federal racketeering laws that would allow lengthy prison sentences for leadership while disrupting the organizational structure that had made the Alliance effective. The prosecutions would be supported by witness protection programs and community safety initiatives that would prevent Alliance retaliation against cooperating witnesses. The Bloods Crips Alliance believes they've created a criminal organization that's too powerful and too deeply embedded in American communities for law enforcement to dismantle, Bondi told the assembled task force. They've calculated that their territorial control, advanced weapons, and community support make them invulnerable to traditional law enforcement responses. She paused, studying the faces of the agents and officers who would be risking their lives to execute the most dangerous gang operation in federal law enforcement history. They're about to discover that no criminal organization, regardless of its sophistication or territorial control, can successfully challenge American law enforcement when we respond with unity, determination, and overwhelming force. Operation Unified Strike will demonstrate that the rule of law cannot be defeated by criminal violence, and that American communities belong to the American people, not to criminal organizations that would replace democracy with tyranny. The briefing concluded with operational assignments that would mobilize over 2,000 law enforcement personnel across multiple agencies. The criminal alliance that had taken 2 years to construct would be dismantled in a coordinated assault that would restore government authority to American communities and demonstrate that gang violence could not successfully challenge the rule of law. As the task force members departed to begin final preparations for Operation Unified Strike, Bondi remained in the operations center, studying the maps that showed alliance-controlled territory in red across significant portions of Los Angeles. Somewhere within those red zones, hundreds of criminals had declared war on American democracy and had established their own authority through violence and intimidation. But they had underestimated the resolve and capabilities of American law enforcement when confronted with direct challenges to governmental authority. They were about to learn that Attorney General Pam Bondi's Justice Department would not tolerate criminal organizations that sought to replace the rule of law with the rule of violence. Within 72 hours, Operation Unified Strike would begin, and the criminal alliance that had challenged government authority would become the target of the largest gang enforcement operation in American history.